Let's return now to where we began the program with calls for a public inquiry into Southern Response and our interview with former EQC Minister Gerry Brownlee. It follows a High Court judgment which found Southern Response had engaged in misleading and deceptive conduct when it deliberately withheld information from customers Karl and Alison Dodds, shortchanging the couple by more than $200,000. The organisation was found to be operating a two-quote detailed repair analysis, and the Dodds unwittingly settled on an abridged assessment in 2013 after the insurer kept the full assessment from them. Gerry Brownlee was the EQC Minister at the time, and here's what he told me about what he knew. Can you clarify for us when you found out that Southern Response was running this so-called two-quote system? When did you find out?
When I read about the judgment.
You didn't have even an inkling before then?
No, not at all. We knew that Southern Response was going to be an expensive exercise. Remember that we bailed out AMI, which was a mutual insurer, so effectively all of the policyholders were the owners of the company. But it was massively underinsured. It became pretty evident fairly quickly that they were going to have trouble making good on all of the contracts they had.
So they were running this system when you were Minister, whether you knew about it or not. This is what they were doing, running this two-quote system. Now that you know about it, what do you think of it?
Can I just say I'm not familiar enough with either the case, or the full judgment, or the operational practice to be able to make a comment about that. I think, I've read the headlines, if you like, from the judgment, from both the defence and prosecution point of view, and I could see some points in both directions. So I'd rather not make a comment about something that was essentially very operational.
So, it was an operational matter. May 2011, the court judgment says senior managers at Southern Response decided on this approach, an approach that's now been ruled by the court to be deceptive. Who were the senior managers at Southern Response at that time who would have had control?
I guess the senior manager, the chief executive at the time, was a gentleman called Peter Rose. But look, I'll tell you what, I've got a lot of time for the man because I think he took over. He was brought into AMI initially to try and sort out exactly what their position was, and was certainly instrumental in reaching a position that said actually they can't meet the obligations, and then became chief executive of the run-out insurer Southern Response, and I think did a pretty good job with what was an incredibly difficult circumstance.
And that was the former EQC Minister, Gerry Brownlee. The issue of two different repair assessments is the subject of a class action being led by Christchurch lawyer Grant Cameron. And he joins us now. Good evening, Grant. Is it possible that Mr Brownlee was oblivious to this two-quote system?
Well, we have to say very, very surprised to hear that being the Minister, but nevertheless, if Gerry is saying that he didn't know, then we have to accept that. So the question has to be, how could that possibly be when as Minister in an arrangement where the Crown has entered into a Crown support deed to provide cash to AMI, and very stringent processes for reporting on liabilities were put into place at the beginning, our ministers couldn't know these things.
So who would have been in the know? Do we know what kind of government representatives may have been in meetings or discussions about these issues?
Yeah, well, there's a Crown support deed entered right at the very beginning whereby the government would support AMI subject to conditions. Now, one of the provisions in that requires that Treasury can have observers at every board meeting, every executive management meeting, various other meetings were prescribed. Now, whether they did or didn't attend, we don't know, but it would be, one would expect that they were all over this very closely because plainly there was an unknown liability for the taxpayer, and it was extremely important to know as this whole thing unfolded what the ongoing liabilities would be. So undoubtedly, Treasury received all the information that was ever supplied to shareholders, rating agencies, the Reserve Bank, bankers, the auditors, senior management, and more particularly the board itself, all materials going to the board were required to be passed on to the Treasury. So it's very hard to see how this wasn't fully and extensively flagged as things went along, and particularly in light of the Supreme Court judgment in Avonside.
Okay, let's talk about that, because this is not the first court case where this issue of a so-called two-quote system was put under the microscope. So can you explain to us where it came up before and how public those reporting or those court cases would have been?
Well, I think it was a very important case, a very important decision of the Supreme Court in a case called Avonside Holdings, and that judgment was delivered on the 15th of June 2015. Now, the important thing to note is that Avonside Holdings was a company, and in the course of the argument through the High Court, Court of Appeal, and on to the Supreme Court, there had not been any reference to misleading or deceptive conduct. The company was simply concerned to ensure that professional fees and contingencies were in fact payable by the insurer, and the insurer had refused to pay it. Now, those sort of payments are part of, shall we say, the concealed information, the information withheld from Dodds and many other people, but there wasn't any description or any real debate about misrepresentation. Nevertheless, once that judgment came out and the Supreme Court said, no, those payments are payable, it came right back to Southern Response to make a decision as to what it was going to do in light of that legal opinion or legal judgment.
So how many people, just looking at the issue generally, how many people do you think are affected here? Because obviously we know about the Dodds, but they're not the only ones, are they?
Well, at the point the Supreme Court judgment came back to Southern Response, there was clearly a major internal meeting. Now, one speculates that had to be with executive management and the legal team, and it would certainly have gone to the board in some form thereafter, and we believe they had obligations to report to Treasury at least. So that being the case, they had to make a decision how they're going to deal with it, and they publicly declared that they would meet settlements by paying professional fees and contingencies from the date of the Court of Appeal judgment, which was 1st of October 2014. However, in doing that, they made an arbitrary cut-off, and the 3,000 people who had been settled before that were to be left out of this process. And that seems to be a rather arbitrary decision, and we can speculate that it might be designed to save money, but we really don't know the facts surrounding that decision.
So, worst case scenario, on the back of an envelope, some people have said that this could ultimately cost the taxpayer in excess of $300 million. Does that seem in the right ballpark?
Well, it probably does on the information that we've got so far. We've had an opportunity to look at quite a large number of client cases now. The average seems to be around the $100,000 mark. Southern Response would know the exact liability, certainly, and since we filed for the class action, they would have very carefully done their homework, and Treasury would have got very accurate assessments, so they will know what the potential exposure might be in the overall.
In this most recent court case involving Karl and Alison Dodds, the court finding sums up that a senior management meeting in, I think it was May 2011, was where this decision was made to run this, in essence, two-quote system and to keep one of the quotes secret. Do you know exactly who was involved in that senior management meeting when that decision was made?
No, I don't have any information about that whatsoever.
Okay. Who needs to take responsibility for this, do you think, in the end?
Well, it's one thing to say that it's an operational matter and it was something internal to Southern Response. Certainly that is the case. That's certainly one part of the story. However, this is a company that's owned by the Crown. The government is concerned to ensure that it has its fingers on the pulse in terms of what the ultimate exposure might be. And plainly, there were clear reporting mechanisms put in place, first with the Crown support deed and then later with an amended Crown support deed. So those lines of communication, that reporting processes, they were well established. So it begs the question as to what government itself was actually told when decisions were made not to backdate payments or settlements that were made before the 1st of October 2014. And it's that 3,000 people or so that we are very concerned with and taking the class action to protect.
Thank you for joining us this evening. That is Christchurch lawyer Grant Cameron. As you heard there, he's involved in that class action, which relates to this idea that there were two different repair quote assessments running through Southern Response.